The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished glass entrance of the Marshall Technologies building in downtown Seattle. Victoria stood near the entrance, her phone in one hand and her sleek leather briefcase in the other, occasionally glancing at her watch. She had just wrapped up a marathon board meeting where her company had finalized plans for a groundbreaking new medical technology that could revolutionize rural healthcare. The wind picked up, making her adjust her burgundy silk scarf. Despite owning the 40-story building that towered behind her, she preferred waiting outside for her driver like anyone else. That's who she was. Grounded, despite her billions. Her mother had taught her that true character shows in how you treat others, not in what you own. She smiled, thinking about her journey from a small apartment above her parents' bakery to becoming one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the country. The smell of fresh bread still brought back memories of doing homework while helping customers, learning the value of hard work, and treating everyone with respect. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, but instead of the usual friendly wave she got from most officers who patrolled this area, something felt different. Officer Peterson stepped out, his face already set in a stern expression. Victoria noticed how his hand rested near his belt as he approached, even though she was clearly just standing there in her business suit, checking her phone like countless other professionals in the business district. "You can't loiter here," he barked, not even trying to hide his disdain. "Move along." Victoria blinked, surprised by his tone. She'd dealt with prejudice before. It came with being a black woman in the tech world. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. "Officer, I apologize if there's a problem, but I'm just waiting for my driver. I actually own this building. I'd be happy to show you my ID." He cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Yeah, right. And I'm the Queen of England. I said move along, or we're going to have a problem." Nearby pedestrians began to slow down, pulling out their phones. Victoria could feel her heart racing, but she kept her voice steady, just like she did during tough negotiations. Never show fear, never lose composure. Another lesson from her mother. "Sir, if you just let me explain." She didn't get to finish. Officer Peterson stepped forward, his face reddening. "You people always have explanations, don't you? Always have some story." He moved closer, attempting to physically intimidate her despite her calm demeanor. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. Here she was, worth billions, featured in Forbes magazine just last month, and none of that mattered in this moment. She thought about all the other black women who'd faced similar situations without her resources, without cameras watching, without the privilege of knowing that one phone call could bring a team of lawyers running. The growing crowd of onlookers created a tense atmosphere. Some had their phones raised, recording everything. Others looked away, pretending not to see. A reaction Victoria found almost as painful as the officer's aggression. Just as Officer Peterson reached for her arm, clearly intending to forcibly move her, a voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, what seems to be the problem here?" Victoria turned to see another police officer, a young Asian woman in civilian clothes, walking purposefully toward them. She held her badge in one hand and her phone in the other, already recording. Something in her eyes told Victoria that maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't going to end the way Officer Peterson had planned. The tension in the air crackled like electricity before a storm, and Victoria knew that what happened next would matter, not just for her, but for every person who'd ever faced prejudice and powerlessness in the face of authority. The atmosphere outside the Marshall Technologies building grew heavier by the second. Officer Peterson's face twisted with anger as Victoria once again tried to reach for her ID in her designer bag. Several onlookers had now formed a loose circle around them, their phones raised like silent witnesses to what was unfolding. "I said don't move," Peterson snapped, his hand now firmly gripping his belt. The late afternoon sun caught his badge, sending sharp reflections across the polished granite walls of the building. Victoria could see her own security guards watching anxiously through the glass doors, but she subtly shook her head at them. Any intervention might only make things worse. Officer, please. Victoria spoke softly but firmly, her years of handling tough boardroom situations kicking in. I'm simply trying to show you my identification. I'm the CEO of Marshall Technologies. This is my building. She kept her hands visible, movements slow and deliberate, just like her father had taught her years ago. A passing delivery man recognized her and called out, "Hey, that's Ms. Marshall. She owns this whole place." But his well-meaning intervention only seemed to aggravate Peterson further. "Nobody asked you." Peterson barked at the delivery man, who quickly backed away. Then he turned back to Victoria, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, so now you've got your people backing up your story. Listen, lady, I don't care who you claim to be. When an officer gives you an order, you follow it." Victoria felt her throat tighten. 20 years of building a tech empire, revolutionizing medical technology, creating thousands of jobs, and here she stood, being treated like a trespasser outside her own building. She thought about her mother's words from years ago. "Baby, sometimes the world won't see your worth, but never let that stop you from knowing it yourself." The security cameras whirred above them, recording everything. Victoria made a mental note of the time, 4:47 p.m. Her legal team would need these details later, not for a lawsuit, but for something more important. Something that might actually create change. Peterson moved closer, his body language increasingly aggressive. "Last warning. Move away from this building, or I'm going to have to use force." The threat hung in the air like thick smoke. A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone muttered, "This isn't right." The collective tension was building, but nobody stepped forward. Victoria recognized this moment. It was just like in business. Sometimes the hardest thing was standing your ground when everything and everyone seemed against you. She straightened her spine, adjusted her scarf, and spoke with the same clarity she used in television interviews. "Officer Peterson, yes, I can see your name tag. I understand you're doing your job. But I am going to stay right here because this is my property. I will not be moving along, and I will not be intimidated." The crowd grew larger. Office workers pressed against the windows of nearby buildings. A street vendor stopped his cart to watch. The whole scene felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. That's when Peterson made his move. He grabbed Victoria's arm roughly, causing her to drop her phone. The expensive device clattered across the sidewalk, its screen cracking, a small but sharp sound that seemed to echo in the tense silence. "That's it. You're coming with me." His grip tightened, and Victoria winced, not from pain, but from the sheer indignity of the moment. She couldn't help but think about all the other people who faced this kind of treatment every day, without cameras, without witnesses, without hope of justice. But just as Peterson started to pull her toward his patrol car, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the chaos. "Officer Peterson, release her immediately." The young Asian officer who had been watching stepped forward, her off-duty clothes contrasting with the unmistakable authority in her voice. As she moved through the crowd, her badge held high, Victoria saw something shift in the atmosphere. Sometimes, she thought, help comes from the most unexpected places, and change begins in the moments we least expect it. The young off-duty officer, Officer Chen, moved through the crowd with purpose, her steps quick but measured. She had just finished her shift at the other end of downtown and was heading home when she spotted the confrontation. Something in her gut told her this wasn't right, and in her 3 years on the force, she'd learned to trust that feeling. She'd recognized Victoria Marshall instantly. Just last week, Chen had shown her younger sister the Forbes magazine featuring Marshall on the cover, telling her, "Look, this is why you should never let anyone tell you what you can't do." Now, watching Peterson rough-handle one of the most successful businesswomen in the country, Chen felt her blood boil. "I'm Officer Chen, 4th Precinct," she announced, holding up her badge while keeping her phone recording. The crowd parted like water around her. "And I believe there's been a misunderstanding here. Her voice carried the authority of her position, even in her casual clothes. Peterson's grip on Victoria's arm loosened slightly, but his face darkened. "This isn't your jurisdiction, Chen. Stay out of it." Chen kept her cool, just like she did during tough situations in her own precinct. "Maybe not, but proper police procedure is everyone's jurisdiction." She turned to Victoria, maintaining a professional tone. "Ms. Marshall, I recognized you from your recent technology conference speech about bringing medical care to underserved communities. Would you mind showing your ID to both of us?" Victoria reached for her purse, her movements slow and deliberate. The crowd watched in complete silence as she pulled out her identification and company badge. Chen examined them, then held them up where Peterson could clearly see them. "As you can see, Officer Peterson, this is indeed Ms. Victoria Marshall, CEO of Marshall Technologies. This building belongs to her company." Chen's voice was respectful but firm. She'd learned early in her career that the best way to help someone back down was to give them a face-saving way out. A light breeze ruffled through the trees lining the street, carrying the smell of coffee from a nearby cafe. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. Victoria stood tall, her dignity intact despite the situation. Some of the onlookers had lowered their phones, but others kept recording, sensing the importance of documenting what happened next. Chen stepped closer to Peterson, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Think about what you're doing here. Think about what this looks like, what it means." Her words weren't just about this moment. They were about every similar moment that had led to protests, headlines, and broken trust between police and communities. Peterson's face went through a range of emotions: anger, confusion, and finally, something that might have been shame. His hand dropped from Victoria's arm. The red marks where his fingers had been were already starting to fade, but the memory of this moment would last much longer. A small group of Victoria's employees had gathered at the building's entrance, watching anxiously. Among them was her longtime assistant, who had finally gotten through to her driver on the phone. The black company car was now pulling up to the curb, its arrival like the closing punctuation on this tense scene. But before Victoria could step toward her car, Chen did something unexpected. She pulled out her work card and handed it to Victoria. "Ms. Marshall, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you further about this incident. I believe we might have an opportunity here, not just to file a complaint, but to create real change." Victoria looked at the card, then at Chen's earnest face. She saw something there, the same hunger for justice and change that had driven her to build her company, to prove everyone wrong who said she couldn't succeed. In that moment, standing on the sidewalk where she'd just been humiliated, Victoria saw a chance to turn this ugly incident into something meaningful. The crowd began to disperse, but the energy of the moment lingered. Sometimes, Victoria thought, the worst situations bring out the best allies. And as she watched Officer Chen calmly begin to file her report, she knew the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Officer Chen positioned herself between Victoria and Peterson, her body camera now properly activated and recording everything. The small device blinked steadily, its red light a reminder that everything happening would be preserved. "I'm calling Captain Rivera," Chen announced, her phone already in hand. She'd worked under Rivera for 3 years and knew the captain was someone who believed in doing things right. The phone rang twice before a firm female voice answered on the other end. Meanwhile, Victoria's security team had finally approached, led by her head of security, a former police officer himself. He nodded respectfully to Chen while keeping a watchful eye on Peterson, who now stood awkwardly to the side, his earlier bravado deflating like a punctured balloon. "Ma'am," the security chief said softly to Victoria, "we'd have all camera angles recorded and backed up." The lobby cameras caught everything from 3 different views. He spoke quietly, but in the tense atmosphere, His words carried weight. Chen finished her call and turned to address everyone. Captain Rivera will be here in 10 minutes. She's bringing internal affairs with her. She looked directly at Peterson, whose face had gone pale. In the meantime, I suggest everyone stays right where they are. The crowd had thinned somewhat, but those who remained were still recording. A young woman in a barista's apron from the coffee shop next door stepped forward, holding her phone. I got the whole thing on video. From when it first started, she offered. The officer was aggressive from the beginning. Victoria watched all this unfold with a calm that surprised even her. Years of handling crisis situations in the business world had taught her that the most important moments often come after the initial storm. She pulled out her own phone. Thankfully, her assistant had retrieved it, though the screen was now cracked, and made a quick call. "Get me the police commissioner's office," she said quietly to her assistant. "And call the mayor too. Not to complain, to propose something." A plan was forming in her mind, one that could turn this ugly incident into an opportunity for real change. Officer Chen overheard and gave Victoria a curious look. Instead of anger or vengeance, she saw something different in the CEO's eyes: determination and purpose. It reminded Chen of why she'd become a police officer in the first place: to make things better, to protect people, to serve her community. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. 2 police cars pulled up, their lights flashing but sirens now silent. Captain Rivera stepped out, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Behind her came 2 internal affairs officers, their expressions serious. "Officer Peterson," Rivera's voice carried authority without needing to be loud. "Step aside and wait with Officer Thompson." She gestured to one of the internal affairs officers, who moved to escort Peterson away from the scene. Rivera then turned to Victoria and Chen. "Ms. Marshall, I apologize for this incident. Officer Chen, thank you for intervening. Now let's go inside and discuss this properly." She gestured toward the building's entrance, but Victoria held up her hand. "Actually, Captain," Victoria said, her voice clear and confident, "I'd like to propose something different. This isn't just about one incident or one officer. This is about a system that needs change, and I think I know how we can start making that change." Chen felt a surge of hope as she watched Victoria pull out her business card and hand it to the captain. Here was someone with the power and resources to make real change, choosing to build bridges instead of burning them. "Captain," Victoria continued, "what would you say to a partnership? One that could transform how police officers are trained and how they interact with the community." The late afternoon sun caught the glass of the building behind them, casting a warm glow over the scene. In that moment, what had started as an ugly confrontation began to transform into something entirely different, something that held the promise of real, lasting change. Within hours, the incident had exploded across social media. The video clips, shot from different angles by bystanders, painted a clear picture of what had happened outside the Marshall Technologies building. But what happened next surprised everyone. Inside her office on the top floor, Victoria sat with her team, watching the footage spread across news channels. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from other business leaders, civil rights activists, and even celebrities offering support. But Victoria's mind was focused on something bigger than just this one incident. "Turn it off," she said to her assistant, who was monitoring the social media response. The flat-screen TV went dark, and Victoria turned to face the group gathered in her office: Officer Chen, Captain Rivera, her legal team, and several community leaders she called in. "Everyone expects me to file a massive lawsuit," Victoria began, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "They're waiting for me to call for Officer Peterson's badge. But that's not going to solve the real problem." Officer Chen leaned forward in her chair. She'd stayed past her shift, knowing this moment mattered. "The comments online are getting heated. People are angry, and honestly, They have every right to be. A small smile crossed Victoria's face as she stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below, the city stretched out like a glittering carpet, thousands of lives intersecting every day. Sometimes those intersections went badly wrong, like today, but sometimes they created opportunities for change. "Look at this," she said, turning back to the room and pulling up a presentation on the large screen. "I've had my team working on this for the past few hours. We're calling it the Community Bridge Initiative." The slides showed a comprehensive plan, a new type of police training program that would combine virtual reality technology, community engagement, and real-world scenario practice. The price tag at the bottom made several people in the room gasp. $50 million. "That's just for starters," Victoria continued. "We'll need more as we expand to other cities. But Marshall Technologies will provide the initial funding and all the necessary technology." Captain Rivera studied the proposal carefully. "This is ambitious, but how do we know it will work?" Victoria clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from similar but smaller programs. "Because parts of it already have worked, just never at this scale, and never with this level of technology behind it." The room grew quiet as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what she was proposing. One of the community leaders, a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years working in the city's toughest neighborhoods, spoke up. "This could be revolutionary, but you'll face resistance." "I always face resistance," Victoria replied with a quiet confidence. "When I started this company, people said a woman couldn't run a tech empire. When I moved into medical technology, they said I was reaching too far. Being told no just tells me I'm pushing the right buttons." Officer Chen had been taking notes, her police instincts telling her to document everything. "The training scenarios in here, they're based on real situations." "They will be," Victoria nodded. "And that's where we need your help. Both of you." She looked at Chen and Captain Rivera. "We need officers who understand both sides of the equation, who want to be part of the solution." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. News vans had gathered below, their satellite dishes reaching up like mechanical flowers. But up here, in this room, something more important than a news story was taking shape. Victoria's assistant knocked and entered with a fresh pot of tea. "The mayor's office is on line 1, she announced, "and the police commissioner would like to schedule a meeting for tomorrow morning." "Good," Victoria said, her voice firm with purpose. "Tell them both yes, and get me the governor's office too. This isn't going to be just a local initiative." As the assistant left, Victoria looked around the room at the faces of people who, just hours ago, had been strangers. Now they were partners in something that could change thousands of lives. "Today started with discrimination," she said softly. "Let's make sure it ends with transformation." Early morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the conference room at Marshall Technologies. Victoria stood before a group of police officials, community leaders, and tech experts, her presentation playing on the screen behind her. Instead of pursuing legal action, she was about to propose something that would change everything. "Imagine," she began, touching a button that brought up a 3D hologram in the center of the table. "A training program that lets officers experience situations from every possible angle." The hologram showed a street scene where officers and civilians interacted in various scenarios. Officer Chen sat near the front, still in uniform from her night shift. She hadn't wanted to miss this. Next to her, Captain Rivera watched intently as Victoria demonstrated how virtual reality headsets would allow officers to experience encounters from a civilian's perspective. "This isn't about pointing fingers," Victoria continued, walking around the table. "It's about building bridges. When I was a little girl, my father had a small bakery. He taught me that understanding comes from walking in someone else's shoes." The police commissioner leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "And Marshall Technologies will provide all this technology." Victoria nodded, but then surprised everyone. We're not just providing the technology. We're creating a complete training center. The old warehouse we own downtown. We're converting it into the most advanced police training facility in the country." Murmurs filled the room. The warehouse was worth millions in real estate alone. Victoria clicked to the next slide, showing the blueprints for the renovation. "Each floor will serve a different purpose," she explained. "Virtual reality training on one level, community meeting spaces on another, classrooms, simulation rooms, and most importantly, a space where officers and community members can come together to share their experiences." Officer Chen raised her hand. "Ms. Marshall, this is amazing, but how do we get officers to buy in? Some might see this as criticism of their current methods." Victoria smiled warmly. "That's exactly why I want you to help lead this program, Officer Chen. You showed us all what good policing looks like yesterday. And Captain Rivera," she turned to the older woman, "your record of community engagement is exactly what we need." The room grew quiet as Victoria played a video on the screen. It showed interviews with people from all walks of life: shop owners, students, elderly residents, and police officers, all talking about their hopes for better understanding between law enforcement and the community. "This isn't just about training." Victoria's voice softened with emotion. "It's about healing. About making sure what happened yesterday doesn't happen to anyone else." A retired officer in the back spoke up, his voice gruff but thoughtful. "I've been on the force for 30 years, seen a lot of programs come and go. What makes this different?" Victoria walked over to him, pulling up another hologram. "Because we're not just throwing money at the problem. We're creating something sustainable." The hologram showed a detailed 5-year plan with measurable goals and outcomes. "Every officer who goes through this program will become a mentor to others," she explained. "We're building a network of understanding that will grow naturally. And the technology will evolve based on real feedback from both officers and community members." The morning light had grown stronger, casting long shadows across the conference room floor. Someone had brought in coffee and pastries, and the smell reminded Victoria of her father's bakery again. Of lessons learned about bringing people together. "Yesterday could have ended very differently," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Instead of filing lawsuits or demanding resignations, we're choosing to create change. Real, lasting change." Officer Chen stood up, her badge catching the sunlight. "I'm in. Whatever it takes, I want to be part of this." One by one, others in the room began nodding, offering support, asking how they could help. Even those who had come in skeptical were starting to see the possibilities. Victoria looked around at all these people: officers, community leaders, tech experts, all coming together for something bigger than themselves. Sometimes, she thought, the worst moments can lead to the best opportunities for change. The news of Victoria's Community Bridge Initiative spread quickly through the police department. In the precinct break room, officers gathered around the coffee machine, their opinions divided. Some saw it as an opportunity, others as a threat to their traditional ways of working. "It's a publicity stunt," one veteran officer grumbled, stirring his coffee with more force than necessary. "Just another rich person telling us how to do our jobs." Officer Chen, who happened to be filling her water bottle nearby, turned to face the group. "That's what I thought too, at first," she admitted. "But yesterday I watched this woman choose understanding over anger. She could have destroyed careers, filed lawsuits worth millions. Instead, she's investing in all of us." The break room grew quiet. Through the windows, they could see news vans still parked outside, hoping to catch the latest developments in the story. But inside, something more important was happening. Minds were starting to open. Captain Rivera walked in, holding a tablet showing the training program's details. "Look at this," she said, placing it on the table where everyone could see. "They're not just throwing fancy technology at us. They're asking us to help design it, to share our experiences, our challenges." The tablet showed videos of the virtual reality scenarios being developed. One simulation put officers in situations they'd faced before, but from the civilian's perspective. Another helped them practice de-escalation techniques in realistic but safe environments. I was there when she first showed the prototypes, Chen added, pointing to one of the scenarios. The technology actually helped you feel what the other person is feeling. It's not just about procedures, it's about understanding. A younger officer who'd been quietly watching spoke up. My brother works in gaming. He says the VR tech they're using is more advanced than anything he's seen. Marshall Technologies isn't playing around with this. Outside the break room, the hallway filled with the usual precinct noise. Phones ringing, radios crackling, the constant movement of people doing their jobs. But something was shifting in the atmosphere. Change was coming, whether they were ready or not. Just then, the police union representative walked in, looking concerned. "We need to talk about this new program," he announced. "The union has some concerns about." But before he could finish, Officer Chen interrupted gently. "Why don't you come see it first?" Ms. Marshall invited the union reps to tour the facility tomorrow. See what we're actually building, not just what you've heard about it. The union rep hesitated, then nodded slowly. He'd known Chen long enough to trust her judgment. Fair enough. But we'll still need guarantees about how this affects our members. Captain Rivera smiled. That's exactly what Ms. Marshall wants to discuss. She's not looking to replace anything. She wants to enhance what we already do well and help us do better where we need improvement. A call came in over the radio. A routine traffic stop needed backup. As two officers headed out, Chen noticed they were talking about the new training scenarios, discussing how they might handle things differently. Later that afternoon, Victoria visited the precinct. She didn't come with an entourage or cameras. Instead, she sat in the break room, sharing coffee and donuts with officers, listening to their stories, their concerns, their ideas. My father always said that the best way to change someone's mind is to first understand what's in their heart. She told them, dunking a donut in her coffee just like any other person on their break. I'm not here to tell you how to do your jobs. I'm here to help build something better together. As the afternoon wore on, more officers dropped by. Some just listened. Others shared their own experiences. The initial resistance was slowly melting away, replaced by something more powerful. Hope for real change and the chance to be part of it. By the time Victoria left the precinct that evening, even some of the biggest skeptics were starting to come around. Sometimes, the hardest walls to break down are the ones we build in our minds. But once they start to fall, anything becomes possible. 6 months after the incident that sparked it all, the Community Bridge Training Center opened its doors. The old warehouse had been transformed into something remarkable. The morning sun sparkled off its glass walls, and a steady stream of officers and community members made their way inside. Victoria stood in the main entrance hall, watching as the first group of officers put on the virtual reality headsets. The technology was even more impressive than the prototypes had promised. Officer Chen, now the program's lead trainer, guided them through the experience. Remember, Chen instructed, her voice calm and steady, this isn't about right or wrong. It's about understanding. Today, you'll experience what it feels like to be on both sides of an interaction. The training room hummed with activity. On one screen, they could see what the officers were experiencing through their VR headsets. A routine traffic stop, but from the perspective of a nervous driver. The officers' reactions were being carefully monitored, not to judge, but to help them understand their own responses. My heart's actually racing, one officer admitted, after removing his headset. I never realized how intimidating we can seem, even when we're just doing our job normally. In another room, community members shared their stories with officers in a comfortable, living room-like setting. An elderly grandmother told about her grandson's fear of police after a misunderstanding. A shop owner described his mixed feelings about calling for help during troubles at his store. The results were already showing. In the first 6 months, complaints about officer conduct had dropped by 40%. More importantly, positive interactions were on the rise. Officers who'd gone through the program were handling tense situations differently, taking that extra moment to see things from another perspective. Victoria walked through the building, stopping to chat with different groups. In the technology lab, developers were working on new scenarios based on feedback from both officers and community members. Each program was custom designed to address real situations that happened in their city. Yesterday, an officer prevented what could have been a bad situation, Captain Rivera reported, joining Victoria by the window. He said it was because of something he learned here. He recognized signs of anxiety he might have missed before, took a different approach. The center had become more than just a training facility. It was a place where barriers were breaking down. In the cafe area, officers and local residents sat together, sharing lunch and conversation. The walls displayed art from local schools, showing how children viewed their community protectors. Officer Peterson, who had sparked this whole journey with his actions months ago, had gone through the program too. Today, he was one of its strongest advocates. I had to face some hard truths about myself, he told a new group of officers. But this program didn't judge me. It helped me grow. In the afternoon, Victoria led a tour for officials from other cities who wanted to implement similar programs. The success stories were spreading, and requests for information were pouring in from across the country. The key is that everyone has a voice here, she explained to the visitors. The technology is important, but it's the human connection that makes the real difference. At the community feedback wall, hundreds of sticky notes shared personal experiences. First time I felt heard, one read. Now I understand why they have to be so careful, said another. Finally bridging the gap, a third declared. As the day wound down, Chen found Victoria watching the sunset through the building's windows. You know what's really amazing? Chen said softly. It's not just changing how officers interact with the public. It's changing how we see ourselves. Victoria smiled, remembering that tense day 6 months ago. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, she replied. We just have to be brave enough to see the opportunity. The center's lights glowed warmly in the growing dusk, a beacon of hope in the city. Inside, another group of officers was starting their training, another step toward building a stronger, more understanding community. 1 year after the incident that could have divided a city, Victoria stood on stage at the National Police Reform Conference. The audience was packed with police chiefs, community leaders, and government officials from across the country. But what made her smile most was seeing Officer Chen and Officer Peterson sitting side by side in the front row. A year ago, Victoria began, her voice carrying through the hushed auditorium. I stood outside my building facing a situation that could have ended very differently. Today, I stand before you with proof that change is possible. On the giant screen behind her, numbers told an impressive story. 30 major cities had adopted the Community Bridge program. Complaint rates had dropped by 60% in participating precincts. Community satisfaction with police interactions had risen by 75%. But numbers don't tell the real story. Victoria continued, clicking to the next slide. The real story is about people. The screen showed a series of photographs. An elderly man teaching young officers about his culture's customs. A group of teenagers giving officers a tour of their neighborhood. Police cadets learning from community elders. Each image captured a moment of genuine connection. Officer Peterson stood up when Victoria called him to the stage. A year ago, he'd been the face of the problem. Today, he was part of the solution. I was wrong, he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. The old me would never admit that. But this program taught me something more important than just new procedures. It taught me to see people, really see them. In the audience, phones remained untouched in pockets. No one was scrolling or checking emails. Every person sat focused on the stage, recognizing they were witnessing something remarkable. "The technology is impressive," Officer Chen added, joining them on stage. "But what really changes people is the connections they make. Every day, I watch tough, veteran officers walk out of training sessions with tears in their eyes, saying, 'I never knew. I never understood before.'" Victoria clicked to a new slide, revealing their latest initiative, a nationwide mentorship program. "We're not just training officers," she explained. "We're creating champions for change in every department. When an officer graduates from our program, they become a mentor to others." The room burst into applause when she announced that Marshall Technologies would fund the expansion to 50 more cities in the coming year. But Victoria raised her hand for quiet. "Money isn't the real solution," she said softly. "The real solution is in this room. It's in every person who's willing to admit they might be wrong sometimes. It's in every officer who chooses to take that extra moment to understand. It's in every community member who's brave enough to share their story." As she spoke, the lights dimmed and a final video played. It showed a scene from just last week, a potentially tense situation diffused by an officer who'd been through the program. The body camera footage showed him using the techniques he'd learned, taking time to listen, finding a peaceful solution. "That officer told me later that a year ago, he would have handled it differently," Victoria shared. "But now he had new tools, new understanding, and most importantly, new hope." The video ended with interviews of people whose lives had been touched by the program. The last clip showed a young boy looking up at a police officer with trust instead of fear. "This is how change happens," Victoria concluded, her voice full of quiet conviction. "Not through force or fear, but through understanding and hope. One person at a time, one story at a time, one moment at a time." As the lights came up, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. But Victoria's eyes found Officer Chen in the crowd, remembering that day a year ago when one person's courage to step forward had started it all. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of bravery. And as Victoria looked out at the room full of people ready to bring this program to their own communities, she knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger.